You don't know who you're laughing at, son, and that's the only reason I'm still sitting here. When three well-dressed strangers mock an old man's cane at a small-town Virginia diner, the only person who stands up for him is Nora Callahan, the stubborn young woman who runs the place and doesn't know why she feels so protective of a quiet regular she barely knows. What she doesn't know is that Raymond Colt didn't wander into her diner by accident, that the cane they laughed at came from a war that took someone she never got to meet, and that the man they dismissed as broken is the reason she still has anything left to protect. When a powerful developer sets his sights on the land beneath her feet, the truth about Ray and about the promise that has kept her safe for 30 years without her knowing will change everything she thought she understood about strangers' inheritance and what the living owe the dead. The Silver Spoon Diner sat on the eastern edge of Harlow, Virginia, close enough to Route 11 that you could hear the trucks downshifting in the early morning, and far enough from the new development on the county line that the parking lot still had cracks in it, shaped like river deltas, weeds pushing through in small, determined fists. The sign out front had lost the second L in grill sometime in the previous winter, and Nora Callahan had not gotten around to fixing it, partly because she had been busy, and partly because she had developed a quiet affection for the gap, the way it made the sign look like it had a story. Most things she loved had stories. Most things she loved were also slightly broken. She did not think about this connection very often. It was a Tuesday in October, the kind of morning that couldn't decide between summer and fall. Warm enough that the door stayed propped open with the same brick it had been propped open with since her mother ran the place. Cool enough that the regulars were all drinking their coffee a little faster than usual. Nora was behind the counter refilling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door rang and Raymond Colt came in. He came in the same way he always came in, which was slowly and without apology. He was a tall man gone slightly to the left by age and injury, his weight distributed between his right leg and the dark wooden cane he carried in his left hand. The kind of cane that looked like it had been chosen for function rather than appearance. The rubber tip worn flat on one side from years of use. He wore a canvas work jacket, the color of old moss, dark trousers, boots that had been good once and were still serviceable. His face was the kind of face that had been weathered into something more interesting than handsome. Deep-set gray eyes, a jaw that suggested opinions held quietly, white hair cut short and neat. He nodded at Nora when he came through the door the way you nod at someone you have an understanding with, and she nodded back and reached for the coffee pot before he had settled himself into the corner booth. He always took the corner booth. He had taken it every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the 3 years she had been managing the diner. And before that, her mother had told her he had been coming in on Tuesdays and Thursdays for at least 2 years before that. 5 years of corner booth black coffee. The eggs and wheat toast on Tuesdays and just the coffee on Thursdays. Always a $2 tip, left folded under the edge of the saucer rather than left flat on the table. And almost never more than a dozen words. Nora respected the economy of it. She was not herself a woman who used more words than the situation required. She brought the coffee over and set it down, and he said, "Morning," and she said, "Morning, Ray." And that was the extent of it. She noticed as she turned back toward the counter that his eyes had gone to the wall to the left of the window, the way they sometimes did, settling on the large black and white photograph that had hung there since before her mother bought the place. It was a photograph of men and motorcycles, taken somewhere flat and bright, the sky behind them enormous and pale. There were 11 men in the photograph. They were young, most of them in their early 20s, and they were grinning with the specific recklessness of people who had survived something that should have killed them, and were not yet sure what to do with the surplus of their lives. The photograph was dated 1948 in the lower right corner, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. Ray looked at the photograph for a moment, the way he sometimes did, and then he looked at his coffee, and that was the end of that. The 3 men came in about 20 minutes later. They were young, late 20s, maybe 30, and they had the look of people passing through rather than passing by. The kind of clean, purposeful energy that belonged to people who knew where they were going next. 2 of them wore sport coats over open-collared shirts. The third had a jacket with a small logo on the breast pocket that Nora didn't recognize, but which had the feel of something that cost more than it looked. They took the large center table, the one with the view of the whole room, and they ordered without looking at the laminated menus, the way people do when they've already decided, and the menu is just confirmation. One of them, the one with the logo jacket, asked for an oat milk latte, and Nora told him they didn't have oat milk, and he looked at her for a moment as though she had said something in a foreign language, and then he ordered black coffee with visible reluctance. They were not bad men, probably. They were men who had gotten used to a certain quality of environment and were now mildly aggrieved by the absence of it, which is not the same as being bad, though it can look like it from the outside. Nora had served enough of their type to know the look. She refilled their waters and went back to what she was doing. She heard the comment about 10 minutes later. The one with the logo jacket said something to the others in a voice pitched just below conversational, the kind of voice that carries precisely far enough to be heard without being accountable for being heard. She caught the tail end of it, something about the cane, something about the way Ray moved, something that ended with a snicker from one of the others and a grin from the third. She did not catch every word. She caught enough. She set down the coffee pot. Behind the counter, Darlene, who had worked the Silver Spoon for 16 years and had strong feelings about everything, looked at Nora and shook her head slightly, the way she did when she thought Nora was about to do something that would cost them a table's worth of tip money. Nora looked back at her. She picked up her order pad and walked to the center table, not because she intended to take their order again, but because she needed to be standing up when she said what she was going to say. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was the pleasant, flat kind that she had learned to use when she was not sorry at all. "I missed part of that. Were you saying something you wanted me to hear?" The one with the logo jacket looked up at her with the easy surprise of someone who doesn't expect to be called on anything. "No, we were just talking," he said. "Because I want to make sure I understand the house rules," Nora said. "In this diner, if you have something to say about another customer, you say it to me first. That's how we do it here. If you said what I think I heard you say, I'd like you to say it louder so the whole room can participate in the conversation." There was a silence, the kind of silence that has weight. "We weren't saying anything," the second one said. He was less comfortable than the first, his eyes moving slightly. "Then you won't mind finishing your coffee and settling up," Nora said. "I'll bring your check." "We haven't finished eating," the first one said. "I know," Nora said. "I'm going to charge you for what you ordered, and I'm going to bring you your check. And when you're done with what's on the table, you're welcome to leave." She held his gaze for a moment. "Or I can bring you more coffee, and we can have the louder version of this conversation. It's your call." She turned before he could answer and walked back to the counter and tore off a check and brought it back and laid it on the table with the professional courtesy she brought to every transaction, regardless of personal feeling. Then she picked up the coffee pot again and went to refill Ray's cup. He hadn't moved. He was sitting the same way he always sat, with the cane leaning against the wall beside him and his hands wrapped around the mug, looking at the middle distance that existed somewhere between the table and the window. But when Nora set the pot down and started to turn away, he said, "You didn't need to do that." "I know," she said. "Could have made it worse," he said. "Could have," she agreed. He looked at her then directly, the way he almost never did, his gray eyes level and measuring like a man taking a reading from an instrument he trusts. "Good coffee," he said. "Same as always." It was not a compliment about the coffee. Or it was, but it was also something else, and Nora was not sure what the something else was. Only that it felt like the beginning of a sentence that was going to take a long time to complete. The three men paid and left without incident. Nora went back to the sugar dispensers. Darlene looked at her with an expression that was 30% disapproval and 70% concealed respect, which was about average for their interactions. The morning continued. At some point during the next 20 minutes, Nora noticed that Ray was looking at the photograph again. She was not sure why she noticed it more than usual. She had seen him look at it dozens of times, but something about the angle of it today, the way his eyes settled on the left edge of the frame, The way his jaw moved slightly, as though he were saying something he had decided not to say out loud, made her look at the photograph herself for the first time in months. 11 men, 11 grins, the flat, bright sky. She had never asked her mother where the photograph came from. Her mother had never offered. It had always been there, had always been part of the background of the place, the way the crack in the counter tile was part of the background, the way the smell of coffee and bacon fat was part of the background, so thoroughly present that it had ceased to be visible. She looked at it now properly for the first time in a long time, and she thought about the fact that it was dated 1948, which meant these men were pushing 80 now if they were alive at all. And that thought settled in her chest in a way she didn't fully examine. Ray stood to leave at his usual time, straightening slowly with the mechanical patience of someone who has made a long study of his own body's limitations and objections. He tucked a folded $2 bill under the edge of his saucer. He picked up his cane. He pulled his jacket straight. "Ray," Nora said, and she wasn't sure why she said it until she heard herself continue. "You've been coming here a long time." He looked at her. "I have," he said. "Did you know my mother before she got sick?" There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 seconds. In the space of that pause, Nora had the distinct, strange impression that she had asked a question he had been waiting for a long time and had never expected to hear. Then he said, "I knew of her," in a voice that was careful, the way a man's voice gets careful when he is deciding how much of a thing to say. "She never mentioned you," Nora said. "By name?" "No," Ray said. "She wouldn't have." And then he nodded once, the same nod he gave her at the door, and he walked out, the rubber tip of his cane marking a soft, steady rhythm across the linoleum, and the screen door swung shut behind him. And Nora stood behind the counter for a long moment, looking at the door, and then at the photograph, and then at the door again. She thought about what he had said. She wouldn't have. Not, she didn't know me, or we weren't close. She wouldn't have. As though it were a choice, as though her mother had made a specific decision not to name him. Nora was not a woman who believed much in coincidence. She had grown up in a diner that sat on a state highway, which meant she had spent her formative years observing the full range of human beings in transit. And the thing she had learned, the thing that 20 years of watching strangers had taught her, was that people who seemed random almost never were. They were always connected to something. The connection was just not always visible from the outside. She went back to work. She told herself she was not thinking about it. She was thinking about it. Later that afternoon, after the lunch rush had thinned and Darlene had gone home, and the only customer left was old Mr. Peterson nursing his pie in the second booth, Nora was wiping down the counter, and her eyes drifted back to the photograph, as they had been doing all day with a frequency that was starting to feel involuntary. She walked over to it. She looked at it up close in a way she hadn't done since she was a kid, close enough to see the individual faces. 11 men. She moved her gaze along the row, young faces mostly squinting against the sun, the kind of squint that looks like joy from far away. She got to the man standing on the far left, slightly apart from the others, the only one who was not quite smiling. He had an expression that she could only describe as watching, even in a photograph, as though the camera were just one more thing in the environment to be assessed. She could not tell from the photograph how tall he was. She could not tell the color of his eyes. She could tell nothing about him that she could hold up next to the man who had walked out of her diner an hour ago and say with any certainty, "Yes, this is the same person." But she looked at the man in the photograph for a long time, and she did not go back to wiping the counter for several minutes. She was still thinking about it when she locked up that night, and still thinking about it when she drove home in the dark past the county line where the new development had been going up for the last 18 months. Glass and steel and a hotel chain logo she recognized. And still thinking about it when she sat down at her kitchen table and opened her laptop to go over the numbers for the month, which were fine. Were always approximately fine. Were fine in the way that a rope bridge is fine when you are in the middle of crossing it and the alternative is the drop. The diner had been in her family for 31 years. Her mother, Patricia Callahan, had bought it when Nora was 3, using money that Nora had never fully understood the origin of. Money that had appeared when the previous owner wanted to sell, and her mother, who worked as a school nurse and had no obvious access to significant savings, had somehow produced enough for a down payment. Nora had asked about it once when she was in her late teens and bold in the way teenagers are bold, which is to say without fully understanding what she might be opening. Her mother had said simply that a friend had helped. She had not named the friend. She had changed the subject with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been changing the subject for years and had gotten very good at it. The friend Nora had always assumed was a woman. She had no particular reason for this assumption. It was simply that her mother's life after Nora's father left had been defined almost entirely by women. The women she worked with, the women who came to the diner, the women in the small, tight circle of her friendships. Men had been present in her mother's world in the way weather is present. Real, sometimes pleasant, sometimes not fundamentally uncontrollable, and best planned around rather than relied upon. Her mother had not been bitter about this. She had simply been practical. She had loved Nora with a ferocity that did not require annotation, and she had run the diner with a quiet competence that Nora had spent the last 7 years trying to inherit. And she had died 18 months ago, of the same stubbornness that had kept her working until she was too sick to pretend otherwise. Nora closed the laptop. The numbers were fine. She did not want to think about the numbers. She thought instead about the way Ray had said she wouldn't have, and about the photograph, and about the man in the photograph who was not quite smiling, and about how 5 years was a long time to come to a diner every Tuesday and Thursday and say almost nothing, and whether that was the behavior of a man who had chosen the diner at random or the behavior of a man who had chosen it for a reason he was keeping to himself. She thought about this until her coffee went cold, and then she washed her mug and went to bed, and told herself tomorrow she would ask him directly. She did not ask him directly. She was not, it turned out, as bold as she had planned to be, which was not unusual for plans made after 10 at night, when the things you are planning to do feel weightless, because no one else is watching you plan them. He came in Thursday, as usual. She brought him coffee. He said, "Morning." She said, "Morning, Ray." He drank his coffee and looked at the photograph for a while, and left his $2 under his saucer and went home, and Nora watched him go and said nothing, and spent the rest of the morning being annoyed with herself for the silence, which was also not unusual. The letter from Voss Development arrived on a Thursday, which Nora always thought was the universe's way of ensuring she could not have a good day twice in a row. It came in a thick, cream-colored envelope with the company's name embossed in the upper left corner, a clean, geometric logo, the kind of design that cost money to look effortless. And it contained 4 pages of dense, pleasant-sounding language that, when translated from its formal register into the kind of English Nora actually used, said approximately this: "We want your land. We are prepared to pay a significant amount for your land. We believe you will find this offer very difficult to refuse. And if you have any questions, our legal team is available Monday through Friday between 9 and 5. The offer was 3 times the assessed value of the property. It was not by any reasonable external measure a bad offer. Nora read it twice, set it down on the counter with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down a loaded object, and went to refill the coffee for table 4. Darlene read it during the mid-morning lull, moving her lips slightly as she went through the legal paragraphs. And then she set it down and looked at Nora with an expression that contained multitudes. "That's a lot of zeros," she said. "Yes," Nora agreed. "Your mama would have." "I know what my mama would have done," Nora said more sharply than she intended, and Darlene picked up her cloth and went back to wiping the pie case with the dignified restraint of a woman who has made her point and does not require it to be acknowledged to know it was heard. Her mother would have said no. Her mother would have said no with the same quiet finality she brought to all the things she had decided, which was the thing about Patricia Callahan that Nora most admired and most struggled to replicate: the ability to make a decision from the inside out, from some deep, unargued place, without requiring external validation to make it feel real. Nora's own decisions felt more provisional, more subject to the friction of other people's logic, more vulnerable to the reasonable question, but why not, if the money is good? She thought about her mother. She put the letter in the drawer under the register and served the lunch rush, and did not take it out again that day. Derek Voss came in person on a Friday. He was younger than she had expected from the letter, somewhere in his late 40s, trim with the kind of maintained appearance that suggested a deliberate relationship with the gym and with the person who cut his hair. He wore a charcoal suit over a white shirt, no tie, and he sat down at the counter with a kind of easy confidence that suggested he was comfortable in all rooms and considered this one no different, which was either genuine self-possession or a very practiced performance of it. And from where Nora stood, it was impossible to tell which. "Ms. Callahan," he said. "Derek Voss, I sent you a letter." "I got it," Nora said. "Good." He smiled the clean, professional smile of a man who uses it often enough that it has become frictionless. "I wanted to come by in person. I always think these conversations go better face to face." "What conversation?" Nora said. "I haven't agreed to have a conversation." The smile adjusted slightly. "Of course, and I respect that. I just wanted to make sure you'd had a chance to look at the numbers." He glanced around the diner with an expression that was trying very hard to be appreciative and landing somewhere closer to appraising. "You've got a great space here. Real character." "It's a diner," Nora said. "Of course." He looked back at her. His eyes were the pale, focused kind, the kind that processed information quickly. "Miss Callahan, I won't waste your time. We're developing the entire corridor between here and the county line. The silver spoon sits right in the middle of the footprint we're working with. I want it. I'm prepared to be very generous, and I'd rather do this as neighbors than as adversaries." He said the word adversaries the way you say a word to communicate that you're not using it as a threat while using it as a threat. "I appreciate the offer," Nora said, using the same tone she had used with the 3 men the previous Tuesday, the pleasant, flat kind. "I'm not interested in selling." "I'd encourage you to think about it," he said. "The offer has a window, 90 days. After that, I can't promise the number stays the same." "After 90 days," Nora said, "it'll still be no." He looked at her for a moment, the smile not quite leaving, but thinning at the edges like ice in early March. Then he picked up a menu he hadn't asked for one. It had been sitting on the counter, and he looked at it and set it back down. "Good coffee," he said. "Best in Harlow," Nora said. He stood buttoning his jacket with a single, practiced motion. "I'll take your word for it," he said, and left. And the bell above the door said its small piece as it swung shut behind him. Nora watched the door for a moment. Then she looked down at the counter where he had been sitting, at the small rectangular business card he had left behind, without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up and held it, and thought about the way his eyes had moved around the room, cataloging the way you catalog something you have already decided belongs to you, and are simply working out the timeline. She put the card in the drawer with the letter. Ray came in the following Tuesday. He came in the same way he always came in, slow and without apology, and took his corner booth, and Nora brought him coffee, and he nodded, and they did the 12 words or less routine, and he looked at the photograph. All of this was usual. What was not usual was that Nora, coming back to top off his cup around 10 o'clock, noticed that he was looking at her with the same measuring quality he had turned on the photograph, direct, assessing, quiet. She set the pot down and met his gaze. "Something happened," he said. It was not a question. "Someone wants to buy the diner," she said. "Or the land, really." He was quiet for a moment. "Voss Development," he said. It was not a question either. Nora felt something rearrange itself slightly in the back of her mind. "How do you know that?" "They've been buying up the corridor," he said. 6 properties in the last 14 months. Yours is the last one they don't have." "How do you know that?" she said again. He looked at his coffee. "I pay attention," he said. She stood there for a moment, the coffee pot in her hand, looking at him, at the white hair and the deep-set gray eyes and the worn jacket and the cane leaning against the wall. Paying attention. 5 years of Tuesday and Thursday mornings, 12 words or less, $2 under the saucer. Paying attention to what, exactly, and for how long, and why. "Ray," she said. "Who are you?" He looked up at her again, and there was something in the gray eyes that was not quite a flinch, but was in the vicinity of one. A small, involuntary recoil from the directness of the question, as though he had been asked it before and had been unsatisfied with every answer he had given. "A man who drinks your coffee," he said. "That's not what I'm asking." "I know," he said. And then he picked up his mug and didn't say anything else. And after a moment, Nora took the coffee pot and went back to the counter, because there was a limit to how hard she was willing to push a man who had given her no reason to distrust him, and every reason to find him strange. The strangeness intensified 3 Tuesdays later. It was a busy morning, one of the fall days that brought the leaf peepers down from the north in their rental cars and their eager appetites, and the diner was running at capacity for the first time in weeks, and Nora was moving fast, refilling, clearing, calling orders back to the kitchen, when she heard a soft impact near the corner booth. She turned. Ray's cane had slipped from where it rested against the wall and fallen to the floor, and he was leaning down to retrieve it. And as he did, the ring he wore on his right hand, the ring she had noticed before, old silver, the kind of ring that has a history, caught the morning light coming through the window and swung slightly on its chain. No, not a chain. A leather cord, dark with age. The ring was hanging from it, which meant it was not worn on his hand, but carried near it, worn against his chest, and had swung free when he leaned. She was at his table before she had made a conscious decision to go there, picking up the cane and handing it back. He straightened, and the ring swung once more, and she caught a glimpse, just a glimpse, of the inside of the band where an inscription would go. And she saw letters, and she could not read them all, but she read 2 of them clearly, before he tucked the cord back inside his shirt. T and C. He took the cane from her. He said, "Thank you," and nothing else, and his hand went to the collar of his shirt, and he straightened it with a small, self-conscious motion that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen him do. She went back to the counter. TC. She thought about what that could stand for. She thought about it through the rest of the morning rush, through the cleanup, through the slow afternoon, with a part of her mind that refused to let it go, the way your tongue goes back to the place where a tooth was. That evening, Voss's first move arrived in the form of a certified letter from the county health department, scheduling an inspection for the following Tuesday. The letter cited an anonymous complaint about ventilation and food handling protocols. Nora had been through enough inspections to know that her kitchen was clean and her protocols were sound. But she also knew that inspections called on the basis of anonymous complaints had a way of finding things to find regardless, and that the timing, 3 weeks after she had told Voss no, was a coincidence she was not prepared to believe in. She sat at the kitchen table that night with the certified letter and the original offer letter and Voss's business card laid out in front of her, and she thought about leverage, and about the fact that she had no lawyer, and Voss clearly did, and about the $112,000 she still owed on the equipment loan she'd taken out 2 years ago to replace the commercial refrigerators, and about how fine was a different word than safe. She was thinking about this when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Ms. Callahan," said a voice she knew. Low, measured, slightly raspy at the edges. The voice of a man who had been doing most of his talking in the inside of his own head for a long time. "I apologize for calling late." Nora looked at the clock. It was 9:15. "Ray," she said. "I heard about the inspection," he said. She set the letter down. "From who?" "Harlow's a small town," he said. "I have friends on the county board." A pause. "Not the kind of friends who can make it go away. The kind who can tell me it was requested by a third party. I thought you should know." She was quiet for a moment. "Why?" she said. The pause this time was longer. It had the texture of something being chosen carefully. "Because I've been coming to your diner for 5 years," he said, "and you make good coffee, and you kicked 3 men out on my account without being asked, and I would prefer not to watch this place close." It was the most he had ever said to her at one time. She was aware of that fact the way you're aware of a sudden silence after a long noise, not in the middle of it, but in the moment after, when your ears start adjusting. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I can handle the inspection." "I know you can," he said. "That's not why I called." She waited. "There's a lawyer in Staunton," he said. "Name's Elaine Kowalski. She does property and land use. She's very good. If Voss is doing what I think he's doing, you're going to need someone who knows how he works." He paused again. "She owes me a favor. If you want, I can make a call." Nora looked at the letter from the health department. She looked at the business card with the embossed logo. She thought about the 12 words or less and the 5 years of Tuesdays and Thursdays, and she wouldn't have. She thought about T and C on the inside of a silver ring hung on a leather cord worn against a man's chest, for what was, by the evidence of the cord's color, a very long time. "I appreciate it," she said, "but I'd rather figure out what's going on first." "That's fair," he said. "Ray," she said, "how do you know about Voss Development?" "Not about the corridor about me. About this place specifically." Another pause. This one had a different quality than the others. This one felt like the pause before a door that was going to stay closed tonight. "Good night, Miss Callahan," he said, and hung up, and Nora sat with the phone in her hand, looking at the letters on the table and thinking about doors. The inspection happened. Her kitchen passed. The inspector, a young man named Todd, who seemed genuinely apologetic about being there, found 2 things to note, both minor, both easily corrected, and his manner throughout suggested he was aware that he was being used as an instrument for something, and was not entirely comfortable with that. She fixed both items the next morning. She did not hear from Voss directly for another 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, 2 of her regular suppliers called to say they were having trouble fulfilling her orders. Not canceling, just adjusting. Just having some issues with distribution that they were sure would clear up soon. And the property management company that handled the small parking lot she leased on the north side of the building sent a letter saying they would be reviewing the terms of their agreement at renewal in 90 days, citing changed circumstances in the local market. None of it was definitive. All of it was directional. It all pointed the same way. The box was in the back of the coat closet, behind the winter things her mother had left behind in the place where her mother had always stored items that required keeping but not accessing. The category of things that sit in a house the way old grief sits in a person. Present without being active, taking up space you've stopped measuring. Nora found it on a Sunday afternoon in late November when she had gone to the closet for the stepladder she needed to change the bulb above the kitchen sink, and instead found herself standing in the half-dark with the box in her arms and no clear memory of having picked it up. It was a shoebox, the old kind, with the lid that slides off rather than hinges open, the brand name faded to illegibility on the side. It was heavier than a shoebox should be. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down with it, and did not open it for several minutes, which was the kind of pause her mother would have recognized as Nora preparing to be braver than she felt. Inside a stack of old letters, rubber-banded and sorted by some organizing principle she couldn't immediately identify. A thin book with a cracked spine, the title worn away. 3 photographs, loose, and at the bottom, in a plain white envelope, a letter in her mother's handwriting. Her mother's careful, slightly right-leaning script that was addressed and sealed but had never been sent. The address on the envelope read, Raymond Colt, care of the Silver Spoon Diner, Route 11, Harlow, Virginia. Nora sat with the envelope in her hands for a long time. She looked at her mother's handwriting the way the R in Raymond leaned forward, slightly the way the period after VA was pressed harder than the other punctuation, as though her mother had decided something in that final mark. The envelope was yellowed at the edges. Not recent, not written last year when her mother was sick and thinking about endings. but old. Years old, maybe decades. The paper the color of a thing that has been waiting a long time. She did not open it. She was not, she told herself, ready to open it. Which was true, but it was also true that she was afraid of what she would find in it. And fear, dressed up as readiness, was still fear, and she was aware enough of herself to know the difference. She set it carefully on the table and picked up the 3 loose photographs instead. The first was a photograph of 2 young men standing in front of a motorcycle. Not the one in the diner, a different motorcycle. The background, domestic rather than dramatic. A yard, a fence, a tree, going rusty with autumn. One of the young men was her uncle, Thomas. She recognized him from the photographs her mother kept. The same wide jaw, the same slightly crooked grin that made him look permanently on the verge of saying something that was going to get him in trouble. She had never met him. He had died in Korea in 1952, when her mother was 19, and his absence had shaped her mother's life in the way the absence of a keystone shapes an arch. Not simply by being missing, but by making everything else redistribute around the gap. The other young man in the photograph was taller, standing slightly back with deep-set eyes and a stillness about him even in the photograph, the quality of a man who takes up exactly the space he occupies and no more. He was not quite smiling. He looked as though he might be watching the camera the way you watch something you are not entirely sure about yet. Nora set the photograph down. She picked up her keys. She drove to the diner. It was Sunday, which meant the diner was closed. But she had the key, and she let herself in through the back and turned on the lights above the counter and walked to the photograph on the wall. She took it down carefully, the wire hanger scraping against the nail, and turned it over. The backing was cardboard, old, slightly warped. She worked the small metal tabs up with her thumbnail slowly and lifted the cardboard away. On the back of the photograph, written in pencil so faint it was barely there, were 11 names. She moved along them with her finger, matching position to name, left to right, front to back. She got to the man standing at the far left, slightly apart, not quite smiling. The man she had been looking at for weeks. And she read the name written beside his position marker. And then she stood in the dark diner with the photograph in her hands and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. Raymond Colt, 23. She hung the photograph back on the wall. She straightened it twice before it was level. She drove home and sat at the kitchen table with the box and the envelope and the loose photographs and the knowledge that had been assembling itself piece by piece for weeks. And she thought about how she felt about it. And the honest answer was that she felt too many things to separate them clearly. She felt something warm and complicated and off-center. The feeling of a door being opened onto a room you didn't know was in the house, which can be wonderful or terrible depending on what the room contains, and she didn't know yet which this was going to be. She still did not open the letter. She thought he should probably know it exists. She thought, I'm going to ask him directly this time. She thought, if he tells me another version of, I pay attention, I'm going to pour his coffee into his lap. She did not pour his coffee into his lap. He came in Thursday. She brought his coffee. She set it down and she stood in front of his table and she said, I found a box of my mother's things. He looked up at her. The gray eyes went very still. There were photographs, she said. I went to the back of the photograph on the wall. I read the names. She held his gaze. Your name is on that photograph. He was quiet for a long moment. The diner around them made its usual sounds, the low conversation from the 2 booths near the window, the clatter from the kitchen, Darlene calling something about the pie special. None of it touched the particular silence that had opened between them. Yes, he said, finally. You've been coming here for 5 years, she said. You knew my mother. You said she wouldn't have mentioned you by name. There is a letter in my mother's handwriting addressed to you, care of this diner, that has never been sent. She paused. What's going on, Ray? He looked at his coffee. He looked at the photograph on the wall. He looked back at her, and she saw something in his face that was not quite pain but was adjacent to it. the expression of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has gotten very good at the carrying, but has not gotten better at wanting to put it down. "I'll tell you," he said, "but not here." He looked around the diner with a brief, sweeping motion, not with an audience. "Then when?" she said. "I'll come by tonight," he said, after closing. She nodded. She picked up the coffee pot and went back to work, and spent the rest of the day in a state of focused distraction. The kind of state where you do everything correctly and remember none of it. Your body carrying out the routine while your mind runs in a different direction entirely. She was not, she told herself, hoping for a particular version of the answer. She was simply waiting for the actual one. She was good at waiting. She had grown up in a diner, which is a place defined by the interval between arrival and whatever comes next. And she had developed patience the way you develop any skill, by being in situations where impatience doesn't help, and patience is the only remaining option. At 6:30, 45 minutes before she was going to close, Derek Voss came in. He came alone this time, without the lawyer, which made him either more dangerous or more honest, and she was not sure which. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee, and she brought it to him, because the alternative was an escalation she was not ready for at 6:30 on a Thursday, with one cook and one server and 6 tables still occupied. "I heard about your supplier issues," he said. His voice was conversational, the practiced kind of conversational that is not actually casual at all. "Supply chain's a mess right now. It's affecting everyone." "Is it?" Nora said. "I also heard your parking lot lease is up for review." He turned his coffee cup in a small circle on the counter. "That parking lot's important to your breakfast traffic, I imagine." "What do you want, Mr. Voss?" she said. He looked at her, the pale, processing eyes. "I want what I always wanted," he said. "The land. The building. I'll give you the same number I offered before, and I'll add a transition package for your employees. 90 days of salary placement assistance. It's a good deal, Nora. It's a better deal than you're going to get from the market if this becomes a legal thing." "If," she said. "If," he agreed, and the word sat between them like a coin on a table, ready to be picked up by whoever moved first. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had not let herself look before, past the suit and the professional pleasantness to whatever was underneath it. She had an eye for what was underneath things. It was, she thought, the main occupational skill of someone who has spent 20 years watching strangers in transit. What she saw looking at Derek Voss was not cruelty exactly, and not simple greed exactly. It was something more compressed than either. Something that looked like a man who had been running from something for a very long time, and had gotten confused about whether the running was toward the thing he wanted or away from the thing he feared. It was a kind of desperation dressed in a very expensive suit, and desperation she knew made people do things that simple greed would not bother with. "I'll think about it," she said, which was not yes and was not no, and which she could see from the slight recalibration of his expression he interpreted as progress. She intended it as a way of getting him out of her diner before Ray arrived. It worked. He finished his coffee, left a 20 for a $5 cup without asking for change, the move of a man who wanted her to know the money was easy for him, and left. She locked the door at 7 and cashed out the register and sent the last of her staff home, and at 7:30, Ray knocked on the glass of the front door. She let him in. He came into the empty diner and looked around it for a moment. The wiped-down counters, the chairs still down, the soft overhead light, with an expression she could not name but that felt like recognition of a private kind, as though the space had something to say to him that it was not saying to her. She poured 2 cups of coffee and carried them to the corner booth, his booth, and sat across from him. He wrapped his hands around the mug. He looked at the photograph on the wall. He said, "Your uncle's name was Thomas Michael Callahan. Everyone called him Tommy. He was 22 years old when he died on a hillside in North Korea in November of 1950, and he was the best friend I had in this world. And I was with him when he died, and I have thought about him every day since. He said it the way you say something you have said in your own head 10,000 times and are saying aloud for the first time. And the gap between those two experiences was present in his voice, a slight roughness, not from emotion, but from the friction of the words finally being outside instead of in. Nora did not say anything. She put her hands around her own mug and let him continue. He had a sister, Ray said, 16 years younger than him. He talked about her all the time, about the fact that he'd barely gotten to know her before he shipped out, that she was barely old enough to remember him by the time he was gone. He worried about her. He paused. The last thing he asked me to do was find her, make sure she was all right. He said, the roughness in his voice increased slightly, then smoothed back out. He said if I don't come back, find my sister's kid. That's what's going to be left of me. He meant your mother. He didn't know yet that there would be you. Nora felt something settle into place in her chest, a weight finding its proper position after a long time of being carried wrong. I kept the promise, Ray said. It took me a while to find her. By the time I did, she had you, and she had this diner. And she was, fine isn't the right word, but she was managing, and she was proud, and she didn't need saving. She needed the kind of support that doesn't announce itself. He turned the mug between his palms. I helped with the purchase. She didn't want to know where the money came from. I let her not know. The down payment, Nora said. Yes. She thought about her mother saying a friend helped. She thought about the choice of not naming him. She thought about the letter that had been addressed to him and never sent, sitting in a box in the back of a closet for decades, whatever was inside it unsaid. Why didn't she ever? Nora started. She didn't want to owe me anything, Ray said. I understood that. She was a proud woman. He looked up from the mug. She came around eventually. The last few years before she got sick, she'd let me come in and have my coffee. We had an understanding. Not friends exactly. Not strangers exactly. Something in between that didn't have a name. She knew you were here, Nora said. All along. Yes. And when she got sick, I came more often, he said. I wanted to make sure the place was going to be all right. Make sure you were going to be all right. He held her gaze direct, the gray eyes steady. I am aware that this is going to sound like surveillance. It sounds like surveillance, she said. I know. It also sounds like... She stopped. She was not sure how to finish the sentence. It sounded like keeping a promise over 40 years. It sounded like the most sustained act of loyalty she had ever heard of. It sounded like something she did not have a single word for. There's a letter, she said, in her handwriting, addressed to you. It's never been opened. He went very still. How long have you had it? I found it Sunday, she said. I haven't opened it. I didn't feel like it was mine to open. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. She looked at him across the table, across the coffee cups and the years, and the photograph on the wall with his 23-year-old face in it. And she thought about how you spend your whole life in a place thinking you know its history. And then you open a box in a closet and discover the history goes back further and deeper than you had room for in your picture of it. Voss was here tonight, she said. He's escalating. The suppliers, the parking lot, it's coordinated. He's trying to squeeze me to the table. Ray nodded slowly. He does that, he said. He finds the load-bearing things and he applies pressure incrementally. He's patient. You know him? I know his type, Ray said. I've been watching what he's done to the corridor. He buys everything around a holdout, and then he makes holding out very uncomfortable. A pause. There's something you should know about the land under this building. She waited. He reached into his jacket and took out a card. A plain white card with a name on it. Elaine Kowalski, attorney at law, Staunton, Virginia. The same card he had offered her weeks ago, which she had refused. He set it on the table between them. Call her, he said. Tell her the address and ask her to pull the property history. There's something in that history that Voss either doesn't know about or is hoping you don't know about.
What is it?
She said. He looked at the card. He looked at the photograph. He looked back at her. Call her, he said. It should come from the records. You'll trust it more if it comes from the records. She looked at the card for a long time. She picked it up. She turned it over between her fingers. She thought about trust and about the 5 years of corner booth and black coffee and $2 under the saucer, and about the fact that a man who had been keeping a 40-year promise to a dead friend was not, on balance, a man she had strong reasons to doubt. Okay, she said. He nodded. He stood slowly with the cane, and he moved toward the door, and she walked with him to unlock it. And as she held the door for him, he paused in the frame and looked at the photograph one more time, from across the room, at the distance he always looked at it from. The distance that had always seemed like careful choice rather than casual habit. And then he nodded once, the way he always did, and went out into the dark. She locked the door behind him. She stood in the empty diner with her hand still on the deadbolt and the card in her other hand. And she thought C, brothers in arms. Thomas Callahan, Tommy, her mother's brother, her uncle whom she had never met. She looked at the photograph on the wall at the young man standing on the far left, not quite smiling, 23 years old in 1948, 2 years before Korea. She had been looking at his face for weeks. She had been looking at it her whole life, probably in the peripheral way you look at something that has always been part of the background before it becomes the foreground. She turned off the lights and went home and called Elaine Kowalski first thing the next morning. Elaine Kowalski had the voice of someone who was always 3 steps ahead of the conversation she was currently in. Not impatiently, but in the way a chess player is 3 steps ahead with attention, with the understanding that what is being said now is prelude to what will matter later. She said she remembered Raymond Colt said it, the way you say something about a person you have complex feelings about, with respect at the center, and several other things arranged around it. And she asked for the address, and said she would pull the records and call back. She called back in 2 hours. The Silver Spoon Diner, Elaine said, sits on a parcel of land that has been held in a revocable living trust since 1991. The trust is called the Callahan Family Trust. The beneficiary in the original documents was listed as Patricia Callahan, and upon her death, her legal heir. Nora sat down. Your mother was aware of the trust, Elaine continued. She signed documentation acknowledging it in 91. She retained the right to manage and operate the property in perpetuity, with one restriction. The property could not be sold or transferred to any third party without the written consent of the trust's secondary trustee. A brief pause. The secondary trustee is Raymond Colt. The room was very quiet. Nora could hear the sound of the refrigerator and somewhere, outside, a car going past on Route 11. So Voss can't buy it? She said. Not without Ray's signature, Elaine said, which is why I suspect Voss has been applying pressure the way he has. He may not know about the trust structure yet, or he may know and be hoping to get you to voluntarily dissolve it before you find out what you have. Either way, as long as the trust stands and Ray doesn't sign, Derek Voss cannot compel the sale. Can he challenge it? He can try, Elaine said. He'd need grounds to argue the trust is invalid, which would be difficult given how cleanly it was constructed. He could also argue that the restriction on sale violates your mother's, now your, property rights, which has more theoretical merit but would take years and significant resources to litigate. She paused again. My professional opinion is that he does not want this in litigation. He wants a quick transaction. The trust makes that impossible. Nora was quiet for a moment. How long have you known Ray? She said. A long time, Elaine said. Long enough to know that when he sets up a structure like this, he has thought about every angle. Another pause, shorter. He's a very deliberate man. Nora thanked her and hung up and sat at the kitchen table with her phone on the wood in front of her. She thought about 1991, which was the year she turned 7, which meant her mother had signed the documents when Nora was 7 years old, when Nora was too young to know what a trust was, or what it meant, or that the quiet man who would one day drink coffee in the corner of the diner her mother owned had already put legal scaffolding around the thing that would one day be hers to protect. She thought about her mother signing those documents and not telling her. She thought about 5 years of Tuesday and Thursday mornings and black coffee and almost no words. And the word that kept rising to the surface of her thinking was watching. He had been watching all this time, not in the way of surveillance, but in the way of someone standing a responsible distance back from a fire they are ready to contain if the wind changes. She thought about how she felt about that, and the answer shifted every few minutes between grateful and furious, and something softer and more disorienting than either. She went to the diner. She went not because she needed to, but because the diner was where she thought, clearly, had always been where she thought, clearly the particular quality of that familiar space, the smell of coffee and old wood, the sound the door made, the way the afternoon light came through the west windows in October and fell across the counter in long, warm diagonals, functioning as a kind of external nervous system, an extension of her thinking into the physical world. Darlene was there doing prep for the next morning. She looked at Nora's face and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Nora made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the counter and looked at the photograph. She had looked at it so many times now, in so many ways, that she felt she should know it completely, should have no new angle left to find. But she was finding one now. She was looking at it as the photograph of a man who was 23 years old in 1948 and had spent the 7 decades since fulfilling an obligation that no authority had required of him, and no one outside himself and a dead man would ever have known about if he hadn't fulfilled it. The word for that was not surveillance. She was not sure there was a word for that in common use. It was something too large for ordinary vocabulary, the kind of thing that sits at the edge of what language was built to carry. She thought about what she was going to say to him. She thought about it for a long time, turning it in her mind the way you turn a difficult sentence, aware of the multiple ways it could land, aware of what you actually mean versus what the words might do on their own, aware that the gap between intention and reception can be very large when the subject is large. She called him. He answered on the 3rd ring. "I talked to Elaine," she said. A pause. "All right," he said. "The trust," she said. "The Callahan family trust." "Yes," he said. "You built a legal structure around my mother's property 30 years ago without ever telling me it existed." "Your mother knew," he said. "I didn't." "No," he said. "You didn't." She held the phone and looked at the photograph. "I want to understand something," she said. "All of this, the trust, the Tuesday and Thursday mornings, the suppliers you probably knew about before I did, the lawyer you had on standby. Was that you keeping a promise, or was that you deciding you knew what was best for me?" The silence that followed was not a defensive one. It was a man thinking hard about a distinction that mattered. "Both," he said finally. "I'm not going to tell you it was purely one thing. I made a promise to Tommy, and I kept it. How I kept it, that was my judgment, and my judgment is not infallible." A pause. "I should have told you sooner. I was—" Another pause. "I was not sure you would want to know." "Why?" "Because people who have taken care of themselves for a long time," he said, "don't always welcome the discovery that someone has been taking care of them from a distance." It was the most precisely accurate thing he had said to her, and it landed the way precise things land, with a small, clean impact, the way a key lands in a lock rather than a stone landing in water. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she felt the particular irritation of recognizing yourself described accurately by someone who should not yet know you well enough to do it. "I need to talk to you in person," she said. "There's a letter." "I know," he said. "Tonight." "Yes," he said. She was closing up that evening, the last customers gone, Darlene's car already out of the lot, when Derek Voss arrived. He did not knock. He tried the front door and found it unlocked. She had not yet turned the bolt and came in, and the bell announced him, and she turned from where she was stacking the day's receipts and looked at him, and felt with great clarity that she was looking at a man who had decided the time for the conversational version of this was over. He had a younger man with him this time, a lean, angular man in a dark jacket, who positioned himself near the door with the specific stillness of someone positioned for a purpose, not a threat or not overtly, but a witness or a presence or a reminder that Voss did not arrive alone. "I got a call from my lawyer this afternoon," Voss said. He was still doing the pleasant voice, but the pleasantness was wearing thin in places like a coat that has been worn too long in cold weather. "About a trust instrument on the property." "Oh," Nora said. "You know about it?" he said. "You called Elaine Kowalski this morning." She did not bother denying it. "I did." "Then you know the trust doesn't change the situation," he said. "It complicates it, but it doesn't change it. The secondary trustee can be compelled to sign under certain conditions." He paused. "I've done my research on Raymond Colt. He's an old man with a bad leg and a sentimental attachment to a diner. He's not a player." Nora looked at Voss for a moment. She thought about the way Elaine Kowalski had said he's a very deliberate man. She thought about the trust constructed in 1991, clean and careful and exactly right. She thought about the cane and the corner booth and the 7 decades of a kept promise. "You should be more careful about who you call a player," she said. Something moved in Voss's eyes, a brief recalibration, the face adjusting to information that didn't fit its current model. "I'm offering you a way out of this before it becomes expensive," he said, "for both of us." "I know you are," Nora said, "and I'm telling you that the answer is still no." She held his gaze. "You should also know that I'm not going to sign anything tonight, and neither is anyone else. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, you can have it with Elaine Kowalski, whose number I'm happy to give you. Or you can leave." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You're going to regret this." "Maybe," she said. "I've regretted things before. It hasn't killed me yet." She walked to the door and held it open. "Good night, Mr. Voss." He left. The man by the door went with him. Nora locked the deadbolt and stood with her back against it for a moment, her heart going faster than she wanted it to, the way your body does the thing your face won't do. And she pressed her hands flat against the door and breathed through it. She called Ray. "He knows about the trust," she said when he answered. "He came here tonight." A pause. A different kind of pause than his usual ones, shorter, sharper. The pause of a man shifting into a mode he recognizes. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "He didn't. It was just a conversation." "But Ray..." She stopped. She was not sure how to say the next part. "He said the secondary trustee can be compelled to sign under certain conditions." "What conditions?" Ray was quiet. "If the trust is found to be invalid," he said, "or if the trustee is found to be acting against the beneficiary's interests." He paused. "He's going to try to challenge the trust. He's going to argue that my role as trustee constitutes a conflict of interest, that I've been operating in my own interest rather than yours." "Can he make that argument?" "He can try," Ray said. The echo of Elaine's words was not accidental, she thought. But to do it, he's going to have to explain to a judge how the trust has harmed you. And to do that, he's going to have to explain what the trust protected you from. Another pause. Which is essentially him. She thought about this. She thought about Voss saying he's an old man with a bad leg and a sentimental attachment. She thought about what it meant to underestimate a man because of the way he carried his weight. "There's something you need to know," Ray said. "Something I haven't told you yet." His voice was careful, the kind of careful she had learned to recognize as prelude. "About who I am, not what I've done. About who I am." She waited. "The photograph on your wall," he said. "The one from 1948. "Yes," she said. "Those were the men I rode with," he said, "after the war. Before Korea, in the years between, when a lot of us had come back and couldn't quite fit back into the shape the country wanted us to fit into, and we needed something that was ours." He paused. "We weren't saints. We weren't criminals, despite what people thought. We were men who needed to be in motion and needed to be together, and we built something out of that need." Another pause, longer. "What we built became something that outlasted all of us. It got complicated over the years. Some of it I'm proud of, and some of it I'm not. But in 1948, in that photograph, we were just men who were alive when we hadn't expected to be." She looked across the diner at the photograph, at the 11 men and the flat, bright sky. "What was the name of what you built?" she said, though she had begun to suspect she knew. He told her. She stood in the empty diner with the phone to her ear and the name in the air between them, and she thought about the 3 young men who had laughed at his cane on a Tuesday morning, and about the word player in Voss's mouth, and about the particular irreversible quality of not knowing who you were dealing with. "That's why he should be careful," she said. "That's not why I told you," Ray said. "I told you because you deserved to know who has been keeping this promise. Not because of the name, because of what the name means, which is that Tommy Callahan's friend was someone who understood obligation in a way that went past convenience." A pause. "I'm not that young man anymore. I haven't been for a long time. The cane is real. The slow walk is real. But the promise is also real. And it has been real for 70 years, and it is not subject to being challenged by Derek Voss or anyone else." Nora was quiet for a long time. She was aware of several things simultaneously. The weight of the phone, the sound of the diner settling around her, the light falling across the counter, and the particular feeling of a story reorienting itself, the pieces clicking into new positions, the picture that had been assembled incorrectly finally showing what it had always been showing. "The letter," she said. "My mother's letter." "Yes," he said. "Come tomorrow," she said. "Come in the morning. I'll have it." "All right," he said. She hung up. She stood in the diner for a long moment, looking at the photograph, looking at the man who was 23 in 1948 and who had been for 5 years, and she now understood for much longer than 5 years, sitting in the corner booth with his coffee, keeping his promise in the quietest possible way, asking nothing, announcing nothing, simply being present in the way of someone who has made a decision that does not require anyone else's awareness to be valid. She was still angry a little. She thought that was probably appropriate. She was also something else, something she did not quite have the vocabulary for yet, something that had the shape and temperature of gratitude, but was larger than gratitude, deeper rooted, the kind of feeling that takes time to name because it takes time to understand what it is actually responding to. She turned off the lights. She locked the door. She went home. And Derek Voss's lawyers filed a formal challenge to the trust at the Rockingham County Courthouse at 8:15 the following morning. And the notice arrived in Elaine Kowalski's office at 9, and Elaine called Nora at 9:30. And the day that had been going to be about a letter became instead about something larger, about a fight that was no longer quiet and incremental, but open and on record, which was, in its own way, a relief, the way a storm is a relief after a long pressure drop. Ray arrived at 8 before the diner opened, and Nora let him in through the back and poured coffee and put the letter on the table between them without speaking. He looked at it for a long moment. The envelope was yellowed at the edges, her mother's handwriting on the front in the familiar right-leaning script. He picked it up and turned it over, and set it back down, and then he looked at her, and she nodded once, and he opened it. She did not watch him read it. She looked at her coffee and listened to the sound of the paper and the particular silence of a person reading something that costs them something to read. It took him 4 minutes. She knew because she was watching the clock above the kitchen window, not intentionally, just because her eyes needed somewhere to be. When he set the letter down, his face had the look of a man who has just been told something he has suspected for a long time, and suspected accurately, and still found harder to hear than he expected. He pressed his fingers flat against the table, both hands, the way you pressed your hands flat when you need the solidity of a surface. "She knew," he said, "about Korea, about how Tommy died." He paused. "She didn't want me to feel," she wrote, "that she never wanted me to feel responsible." Nora was quiet. "I did feel responsible," he said. "I have felt responsible for 70 years. He looked at the letter. "She knew that too. She said she knew it." He picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking. "She said the diner was hers, not mine, and that she knew the difference, and that she hoped I did too." A long pause. "And that she was glad I was still alive, that she was glad I had come back even when Tommy didn't, because—" His voice caught, very slightly, the barest roughness, and he cleared it. "Because Tommy would have wanted someone to come back." Nora looked at the letter. She thought about her mother sitting down to write this, and sealing it, and addressing it, and then putting it in the box in the closet, instead of sending it the way people write letters to say things they need to have said, whether or not the other person receives them. She thought about the specific loneliness of that, having said the thing you needed to say, and still not being sure the other person knew. "She should have sent it," Nora said. "Yes," Ray said. "But she didn't. And I understand why she didn't." He looked at the letter one more time, and then he folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. He looked at Nora. "She wrote one other thing." Nora waited. "She wrote, 'Tell her about Tommy. When the time is right, tell her who he was.' I never could figure out how." He set the envelope on the table between them. "I think this was the time." Nora felt something release in her chest, a tension she had been holding without knowing she was holding it. The held breath of a question that had been waiting to be answered. She thought about her Uncle Tommy, 22 years old, on a hillside in North Korea, asking his friend to come home and check on his little sister's kid. She thought about the specific quality of trust embedded in that request. Not just trust in Ray as a person, but trust that the world was the kind of place where a promise could carry across decades and geography and the ordinary attrition of life and still arrive intact. "Tell me about him," she said. "Tommy." Ray looked at her. Then he leaned back slightly. And for the first time in all the years she had known him, she watched his face do the thing faces do when they are no longer guarding something, when the effort of holding back has finally been balanced by the effort of holding on, and the scales tip, and what's on the other side of the holding back turns out to be something that needs to be said out loud. "He was the funniest man I ever met," Ray said, "and the most loyal. And he had absolutely no sense of self-preservation, which was a liability in peacetime and an asset in the war, depending on the day." Nora laughed short and surprised, and Ray's face moved toward a smile, and for a moment the diner was full of something warm. Then Elaine called. Nora stepped to the back to take the call, pacing between the prep counter and the walk-in door. Elaine's voice was measured and precise, and moving quickly. "Voss filed a formal challenge this morning. His argument has two prongs. First, that the trust was constructed without your mother's full understanding of its terms. And second, that, as secondary trustee, Ray has been operating in conflict of interest by influencing decisions related to the property while concealing his role." A brief pause. Neither argument is particularly strong on its merits. The first is going to fail on documentation your mother signed an acknowledgement of terms in '91 with full legal counsel. The second is more nuanced, but it requires Voss to prove that Ray's actions constituted active harm to your interests, which is going to be very difficult to establish when the primary effect of those actions has been to keep your property protected. "What do we need to do?" Nora said. "We need to show up," Elaine said. "There's a preliminary hearing before the County Board of Supervisors on Friday. It's not a court proceeding, it's a public hearing on whether there's sufficient grounds to advance the challenge to litigation. If we can establish at that hearing that the trust is valid and Ray's trusteeship has been in your interest, the challenge dies there." Another pause. "Ray needs to be present. He needs to speak to the trust's purpose and his role." Nora looked through the service window at Ray in his corner booth, the letter on the table in front of him, his hands around his coffee mug. "He'll be there," she said. She went back and told him, and he listened and nodded, and she waited for him to say something about whether he was willing to speak publicly about the trust's origins, because to speak about the trust's origins was to speak about Tommy, and about the promise, and about who he was. And she knew enough about him now to know that none of that was something he had been in the habit of saying out loud. He said, "All right." She said, "You understand what you'll have to explain?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him. "You've been protecting this place from a distance for 30 years. You don't have to do this part from a distance." He looked back at her, the gray eyes direct. "I know," he said. "That's why I said yes." Friday arrived with the flat, gray light of a November morning that couldn't commit to rain. The Harlow County Board of Supervisors held their public hearings in a room in the town hall that smelled of old carpet and municipal ambition, with folding chairs arranged in rows and a raised table at the front where the 5 board members sat with their water glasses and their name placards, and the particular expression of people who are trying to appear more neutral than they feel. The room was full. Nora had not expected that. She had told no one beyond Elaine and Ray and Darlene, who had the discretion of a state secret and the information distribution network of a small-town diner, which meant that by Thursday afternoon it had been through the Silver Spoon's breakfast crowd, and by Friday morning there were 47 people in the folding chairs, including 6 members of the county planning committee, the owner of the hardware store 2 blocks down, 3 of her regular customers who had clearly come on principle, and, in the back row, 5 men who were somewhere between 60 and 75, and who had arrived on motorcycles that Nora had heard from the parking lot before she saw them. Men who had the bearing of people who are accustomed to being an answer to a question, and are waiting quietly for the question to be asked. Ray had not told her about them. When she looked at him sitting beside her in the front row, he said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, and was clearly something. Derek Voss was there with 2 lawyers and the lean, angular man from the diner. He had dressed carefully, a dark suit, the kind of suit that was intended to communicate seriousness and resources simultaneously. He sat at the table provided for petitioners with the self-possession of a man who has been in rooms like this before and expects the outcome. The hearing opened with a statement from the board chair, a woman named Carol Ashby, who had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who has seen enough public hearings to know which ones are simple and which ones are not, and who appeared to have already formed a preliminary view of which category this one fell into. She summarized the challenge, invited Voss's counsel to present. Voss's lead lawyer, a man named Hargrove, compact and precise, with the clipped delivery of someone who has learned that judges and board members respond to efficiency, laid out the 2-prong argument concisely. The trust had been constructed without adequate disclosure to the beneficiary of the trustee's personal interest in the property. The secondary trustee had exerted ongoing influence over the property's management and the beneficiary's decisions while concealing his role and his connection to the property's history. The trust should be dissolved as a product of undisclosed conflict. If the trust was dissolved, the sale could proceed. The language was careful and the structure was clean, and Nora felt, listening to it, the particular vertigo of watching someone construct an argument that was technically coherent and fundamentally false, the 2 things existing in the same space without contradiction, which was something she had always found more disturbing than simple dishonesty. Elaine presented their response with the same efficiency she brought to everything. The trust documents were introduced into the record. The acknowledgement of terms signed by Patricia Callahan in 1991 with full legal counsel. A timeline demonstrating that the trust had been in place and unmodified for over 30 years. A statement of the trust's protective function. The restriction on sale had prevented the property from being acquired by third parties through the ordinary market pressures that had consumed every neighboring property in the corridor. Then she called Ray. He stood. He took his cane and he stood, and the room watched him, and Nora watched the room, And she thought about the three young men with the sport coats and the easy laughter. And she thought, "You do not know who you are looking at." She thought that about most of the room, honestly. The people in the folding chairs who were watching a tall, old man with a cane and a quiet face and did not yet know what they were seeing. He said his name into the record. He said the date the trust had been established and the reason. He spoke about Tommy Callahan, and he spoke about the promise, and he spoke about Patricia Callahan and the money for the down payment and the 30 years of Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and he spoke in the plain, undecorated language of a man who has rehearsed nothing and is simply reporting what is true. And the room was very quiet, in the way rooms get quiet when they are listening to something that is not performing. When he was finished, Hargrove asked if he could clarify something. The board chair said he could within reason. Hargrove said, "Mr. Colt, you've stated that your reason for establishing the trust was a promise made to a deceased individual. Is it not true that you also have a personal and financial history with the property that predates Ms. Callahan's ownership?" "Yes," Ray said. "And is it not true that you failed to disclose this history to Nora Callahan upon her assumption of management?" "I disclosed it when she asked," Ray said. "I should have disclosed it before she asked. That is a fair criticism." Hargrove blinked. He had the look of a man who has asked a question expecting the answer to be the answer, and has been given the truth instead, and is not sure what to do with it. "And yet," he said, recovering, "you continued to influence decisions affecting the property." "I offered information," Ray said. "Ms. Callahan made her own decisions. I can give you examples if it would be useful." He looked at the board chair, not at Hargrove. "Every choice about this property, in every meaningful sense, has been made by the woman sitting in that chair. The trust did not take that ability from her. It protected the environment in which she could exercise it." Carol Ashby made a note. Hargrove tried 2 more angles. Ray answered both of them with the same quality, direct, accurate, without flourish, without defensiveness. The testimony of a man who has nothing to hide. Not because he has done nothing wrong, but because he has done nothing he is ashamed of. It was, Nora thought, a specific kind of authority, the kind that does not come from position or volume, but from the simple fact of a person being exactly who they say they are. Then Voss spoke. He had not been scheduled to speak. It was his lawyer's show. But he stood, and the board chair gave him a measured look, and said he could have 2 minutes. And he used them. He said that the corridor development was a matter of economic progress for Harlow, that the silver spoon was the last obstacle, that the trust was an instrument of a private individual's sentimentality being imposed on a legitimate business process, and that the board should see through the emotional presentation they had just witnessed to the legal and economic reality. He said it well. He was good at saying things well. And he was saying something that was not without logic, because there was a version of the argument, the version where you stripped away the history and the promise and the 40 years and looked only at the transaction, where he was not entirely wrong. The trust did restrict the market. The trust did represent one man's judgment being imposed on another person's property. The version of this without the history would look different. But Nora had the history. She stood. She had not planned to speak. Elaine had not planned for her to speak. She stood, and the board chair looked at her, and she said, "I'd like to say something." The board chair said, "2 minutes, Miss Callahan." Nora looked at the board, and then at the room, and then briefly at Voss. "The trust," she said, "has never stopped me from doing anything I actually wanted to do. What it stopped me from doing was selling under pressure, which is not the same thing." She paused. "Mr. Voss has spent the last 3 months cutting my supply chains, pressuring my landlord, filing a health inspection on the basis of an anonymous complaint, and arriving at my diner after closing to make the terms of his offer clear, while standing with a second person near my door. He is not trying to buy a property. He is trying to make it impossible for me to keep one." She looked at Voss directly. "I grew up in that diner. My mother built it, And she built it with help from a man who kept his promise for 7 decades because he said he would. The idea that the problem here is the legal structure that made that possible, rather than the person trying to circumvent it is, she paused, looking for the right word, and found it, a creative argument. Several people in the folding chairs laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one. Voss's face did not change in any dramatic way. What it did was subtract something, a layer of the professional pleasantness peeled back to show what was underneath, which was a man who was genuinely personally affronted. Not because his business was failing, because he was losing to a woman in a diner, in a room full of people, and the losing was being witnessed. "Miss Callahan," he said, and his voice had dropped the professional pleasantness almost entirely, the cold beneath it now audible. "You are protecting a building. I am offering you enough money to build 3 buildings. The fact that you can't see past the sentiment of the thing," "The sentiment of the thing," Nora said, "is that it's mine." "It's real estate," he said. "It doesn't have feelings." "I didn't say it had feelings," she said. "I said it was mine." "Those are different claims." She looked at him steadily. "You want to know the difference between you and Ray Colt? He never once told me what I should want. He just made sure I had the ability to choose it." Voss said nothing. For the first time since she had met him, he had no professional pleasantness to reach for, and no prepared response. And the silence that resulted had the specific quality of a man confronting the edge of his own model of how things work. The board chair called the discussion to order, and the board deliberated for 11 minutes and returned to finding that the challenge to the trust did not meet the threshold for advancement to litigation. The trust stood. The restriction on sale stood. Derek Voss could not compel the sale of the Silver Spoon Diner. He stood very still when the finding was read. He stood still in the way of a man processing information that contradicts his model of how the world works. Then he turned and he looked at Nora. And there was something in his face that was not rage and was not quite grief. It was something older and more private. The expression of a man who has built an entire life around a certain kind of momentum and has just been stopped and doesn't know yet what stillness feels like. She looked at him, and she thought about what she had seen when she looked at him before the desperation compressed into a suit the man running from something he had mistaken for a destination. She thought about his offer of a transition package for her employees, 90 days of salary placement assistance, and the fact that it had been genuine, she thought, in the specific way that generosity is genuine when it comes from guilt. She thought about how much she did not know about why Derek Voss needed this particular piece of land in this particular way. She did not say anything to him. There was nothing useful to say. He gathered his lawyers and his documents and his lean, angular man, and he left, and the door closed behind him and the room exhaled. She was standing in the middle of the room when she heard the sound of boots on the old tile floor, and she turned, and Ray was standing behind her, his hand at his side and the cane in his left hand. And the 5 men from the back row were behind him, not pressing forward, not performing anything, just present, the way backup is present when it is not needed, but was always going to be there if it was. She looked at him. He looked back. And then he stepped forward, and she watched him do the thing he had not done in 5 years of Tuesdays and Thursdays. The thing that 12 words or less had never included. And he said, "You did good." 3 words. She thought that was probably exactly the right number. She said, "We did." He looked at her with the gray eyes that had been looking at the photograph on her wall for 5 years, and she thought about the man in the photograph, 23 years old, and not quite smiling, with the whole enormous sky behind him. And she looked at this man, 75 years old, with his cane and his weight on one side, and the same quality of watchfulness he had carried his whole life. And she thought about continuity, about the specific thing that persists in a person across all the years and the changes and the losses. The thing that is still recognizable even when everything else has changed. And she thought, yes, that's him. That's the same person. All of it is the same person. Outside, the morning had committed to gray, but not to rain, and the 5 men's motorcycles were parked in a line in the lot, and the hardware store owner was shaking Ray's hand, and Darlene was telling someone, loudly and with great satisfaction, about the health inspection and the anonymous complaint. And the small town of Harlow was in the process of absorbing a story it would be telling for a long time. Nora went back to the diner that afternoon. She went in through the back the way she always did, and she turned on the lights, and she started the coffee, and she stood behind the counter in the familiar smell of old wood and roasting coffee, and she looked at the photograph on the wall, the 11 men and the flat, bright sky, and the date 1948 in the lower right corner, and she took it down. She turned it over. She worked the backing off carefully. She looked at the 11 names written in faint pencil on the back, and she looked at the man on the far left, Raymond Colt, 23. And then she looked at the man to his right, the one with the wide jaw and the crooked grin, the one who had been going to get himself in trouble since before the camera shutter closed. She found his name. Thomas Callahan, 22. She had looked at this photograph her whole life. She had never known that she was looking at her family. She put the backing on carefully and hung it back on the wall, and stepped back and looked at it from the distance you look at things that are part of the room that have always been part of the room. And then she looked at it from the closer distance of someone who now knew what she was seeing. Ray came in through the back door at 4 o'clock. He came in through the back, which he had never done before, which meant the front door and the bell and the slow walk across the diner were not what this was. This was something else, a different kind of arrival. The kind that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She had coffee waiting. She set it down at the counter, not the corner booth, and she sat on the stool beside the one she'd put the coffee in front of, and he sat down and wrapped his hands around it, and they were quiet for a moment in the way that is comfortable rather than empty. "The men who came today," she said. "The 5 in the back. Old friends," he said. "Are there more of them?" He looked at her with a slight measure of amusement. "Some? Did you call them, or did they just know?" "Both," he said. "The old ones, they just know." He drank his coffee. "They came for Tommy as much as for me. He was one of theirs too for a while, before Korea." She thought about that, about the photograph dated 1948, and Korea in 1950, and the 2 years between, and the men on the motorcycles going somewhere, flat and bright with the enormous sky behind them, young and reckless and alive. She thought about Tommy Callahan at the edge of that photograph with his crooked grin. "He would have liked this place," she said. "The diner?" "He would have eaten everything on the menu," Ray said. "Twice. And argued with Darlene about the pie." "Everyone argues with Darlene about the pie," Nora said. "Then he would have fit right in," Ray said. She looked at her coffee. She thought about what she wanted to say and how to say it. And then she decided that overthinking it was what she had been doing for weeks, and she was going to stop. "I want to fix the sign," she said. Ray looked at her. "The L. The missing L in grill." She turned to look at him directly. "I've been leaving it because I got attached to the gap. But I think I was attached to it because it felt like mine, like something I'd decided, even if I'd decided it by not deciding." She paused. "I want to fix it. I want to fix it and put something else up that says what this place actually is, which is something that has been here a long time and has been protected by someone who kept his word, and which is going to keep being here." Ray looked at her for a moment. "What would you call it?" he said. She thought about it. "I'd keep the name," she said. "My mother's name, but I'd put something under it, something small." She looked at the photograph. "Something about the people who built it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tommy would have wanted his name on something eventually. He always did." The corner of his mouth moved. He was never as modest as he pretended. She laughed. He almost smiled. Outside, the gray November light was softening toward the hour when it would be evening. the hour when the diner's lights would come on and be visible from the road. The warm yellow light in the windows that meant open and warm and here. The trucks on Route 11 were downshifting in the distance. The cracks in the parking lot were there in the dark, the weeds in their small, determined fists, and the brick that held the door and the bell above it, and the photograph on the wall with its 11 men and its flat, bright sky. Nora reached past Ray and picked up the photograph from where she had set it on the counter. She had taken it down again to look at the names and not put it back yet. And she looked at the man on the far left one more time. 23 years old, not quite smiling, watching. She handed it to Ray. He took it. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression doing the complicated thing she had come to recognize as the particular expression of a man confronting a version of himself that no longer exists, but has not yet entirely stopped being him. He looked at Tommy. He put his finger on the name. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After a while, he handed it back, and she set it on the counter between them, and they had their coffee, and the evening came in through the windows the way it always did, slow and golden and entirely reliable. And the trucks kept downshifting on the state road. And the diner made its small sounds of settling and being, and that was enough. That was, in fact, more than enough. She was reaching to hang the photograph back on the wall when Ray said, "Your uncle said you'd be the stubborn one." She stopped. She turned and looked at him. "He did. Last thing he said that made me laugh," Ray said, and the corner of his mouth was doing the thing again. The almost smile, the one that had probably been there at 23 and was still there now, still recognizable, still his. He said, "She's going to be the stubborn one, Ray. You're going to have your hands full." He looked at her steadily. He was right. She hung the photograph back on the nail. She straightened it once until it was level. "Tell him he was right," she said. "Next time you talk to him." Ray looked at the photograph. He looked at it the way he had always looked at it from the beginning, from the first Tuesday 5 years ago and every Tuesday since, with the specific attention of someone talking to someone who cannot talk back, but is still present in some way that resists easy explanation. He nodded once. "I will," he said.